Hello and welcome to smarthelping.com. Got a new model for you. This is a joint venture real estate model. Goes up to 10 years. Is annual only. And we're going to spend probably most of the time talking about the waterfall logic because it's the most complex thing in here. So let's get started. First tab is just going to show you all the tab names and the description of each one. The next one is going to be your global assumptions. So, the building or project name up at the top, address, and that's going to flow over to the executive summary right here dynamically. Then we've got your inputs. So just some general things like, uh, we've got units, net rentable area, just some general information. None of this really goes anywhere besides right here. Um, but then we start to get into capital structure, and here we've got like the purchase price, your capex, percent of the capex that you think is going to be financed. The remaining is going to be an equity requirement, pre-purchase fees, if any, and then here's your first LTV, and that's going to define, what your loan is going to be relative to the value of the building or the purchase price here. And then your remaining amount is going to be equity, which is going to have to be split between the sponsor and the investor. Now, this model can work on a regular deal where there's just a one owner operator, there's not an investor and a sponsor. All you would have to do is just adjust the assumptions. So 100% of the debt or 100% of the equity is financed by the investor. And then when you go to the waterfall, you're going to make all of these for the LP, or the also known as the investor, 100%. And then the investor is now in this case the operator, and it'll just do all the cash flows to them. There'll be no split. So it can work with just one operator, but it's meant to be for a joint venture and waterfall distributions that define who gets how much cash and when. So you got that. Some just general acquisition metrics here, not super important, but nice to see on a summary. I think this is current operating income, debt service, cash flow debt service. So just kind of what's going on right now before the actual acquisition happens. Then you've got returns, and this is over the full amount length of time that the deal happens, which you'll be able to define a year of refinance, obviously the loan details on the refinance, as well as the year of exit, and all that will affect your annualized ROI for each party. Then we've got equity contribution. So this is going to define how much the investor versus the sponsor is putting in for cash. Obviously, in these deals, typically your investor has much more than the sponsor, but the sponsor is obviously running things. So, um, and the whole deal behind the waterfall distribution is that you're giving the sponsor an incentive to try to get more cash to the investor. And so the higher the internal rate of return is to the investor, the more share of cash flows that the sponsor will get. Then debt service, so this is just loan details for the first loan. Now, if we go over, the next part is your rent rolls. So this is defining your main types of units. We've just did 5 here. Unit count, rent per unit. Just all we're trying to do is roll up to figure out what the annual potential rent is. You can do a percent under market based on the market value of each unit. Then you can do, from that, you can figure out what the actual market annual rent should be. And then here, right beside that, you can determine what you think you want your year one increase to be from current, um, which could be based on renovations or what have you. But you can define that right here for each unit type. And then you can see what you're increasing each unit by, or what you're increasing each unit to, and what the increase amount is by. So, for example, you're starting at 449, and you're increasing it. If you did it by 10%, you're now at 4 94, which is $45 increase. So these are just and this could easily be expanded to as many unit types as you want. The main things that pull from here to the main pro forma are just your total annual rent revenue. Now another way you can do it is you can do a drop down here to choose detailed or high level. If you choose high level, it's just going to pick this. So you can just put in your annual rent roll current and annual rent roll year one and just define it right here. You don't even have to do any of the details if you don't want to. And the model will pull from that. Same with helper data. This has just got some stuff for the debt service, which you don't need to worry about. This is just for a reference. But here, you can say if you want to use high level or detailed. If you hit no, it's just going to use your detailed information on the pro forma for the expenses, which you can define here. And then you can define a percent that they go up by. Or I'm sorry, that's income. Here's your expenses. You define each one per year based on these inputs all here in light yellow, and then it'll go. But if you choose on the helper data to hit yes, then you can see this 850 is just going to populate right here. It's going to ignore all of this and just start at 850 and then increase it still will increase by that percentage. So there's just some dynamics there that make this a bit easier to use quickly, depending on what you're doing, and if you don't want to go through all the details of your expenses. Let's see. So helper data. So in general, the pro forma detail is kind of like where you're really driving all of the different revenues and expenses and the main inputs. This is where you're defining if you want to see like an investor that was a part of the investor pool, like say you invested 100,000 within the whole investor side of it, shows you that share and what that share would be like over time. Um, Here's the full investor pool shares, and then the sponsors got the remaining. And all of this will drive is taking the net operating income and then finding out your total distributable cash flow. And that's including the refinance that happens, which here you can see you define a LTV for the refinance, and it's going to based on the year of the refinance, which you define right here. You see I can put it to year 2, and it moves over, or year 4. And based on that, it'll show you what what you're able to actually refinance at based on the LTV. And um, you can see here if the exit value is 13 million, add that net operating income here at 1.1 million. I think it's using this refi rate. It's using, I'm trying to see here. It's using H34, H6. Just seeing what the cap rate is. Oh, duh. We put it right here. So you can actually define the exit cap rate, and it can be different in each of the years if you want, but you can define that there, which is going to define the building value, which is going to be used to find your LTV on a new refinance loan. So it's saying you get 10 million in year 4, you pay off your initial loan, and then there's some remaining cash you can distribute. Um, we've got all kind of assumption here for penalties, lender fees, if any that's applicable. You can fill it in based on these percentages. And then your refi rate, this is just the loan term of the refinance loan, which is going to come in here. And this is using all your main global inputs. The only difference is going to be obviously the interest rate and the amount, which you'll define, like I said, right there. And then we don't need this anymore because we turned this into a waterfall-based distribution, so that's not needed. So refinance. Now this with debt schedule is really hard to figure out, but basically you can define on the first loan if it's interest only through a certain amount of years, you're going to want to define the first payment date and the start date of the project. This is mainly, the first payment date for the first loan. Um, these should just always match. But when you get into the debt refi, you always want the start date of the project, so 2018, you want that to be accurate so that this knows, okay, if that happens, then year 5 is your refinance year. And this is just defined by the pro forma, the year you're refinancing. So you always want to make sure that lines up because your refinance logic needs to know what year you're actually doing the refinance so it can do all the math there. So this is important. So the start date of the project, this 1/1/18 should always match this one here, and these are just arbitrary numbers for this, so that's fine. But just make sure, um, and actually, I don't think it. Let's see if we change this to 17, year 6, 19. It's okay then. Actually, so it's fine. You can put whatever you want here for the year. For the date, just make it 1/1 or month, and then the first day of that month, and then whatever year, because this is automated based on the pro forma year out of refinance. So that's fine. Actually, it's not too sensitive. Uh, okay, so pro forma. We talked about the refinance loan. Now we've got exit strategy, so you can do your exit cap rate, the exit value, your debt pay down. So this is paying off the balance of the refinance loan or the original. If you don't refinance, it'll just go to the original. Uh, for example, you can just put refinance year here. You could do NA, and there was no refinance, and now you're just on the main loan the whole time. As you can see here, and that should be the same debt service every single year. 451. Yep, it is. So it's just doing your main loan, and you pay it off upon the exit year. So we got that. So we've got no refinance happening, and the exit value, the loan pay down now is just your first loan, which you can see the math going on there to figure that out. So 5,666,000, you paid off about 1.2 million over 10 years. So you still got to pay the rest back on your exit. Then you can distribute the rest of the cash flows. So this is going to, let's go back to put this to year 4. So then we've got our kind of summary for cash flows for the investor, the portion of an investor, and then the sponsor. Annualized ROIs, internal rate of return, investor balances, total ROI over the lifetime of the deal. You can see that here in these two. But I wanted to add, so this executive summary is new, and I wanted to add this to just see a nice high-level view of like, okay, here's your revenues, here's expenses. There's no light yellow anywhere, so you could print this off as just your numbers for revenues, operating income, other items, and then cash flow to sponsors versus investors. So this always matches up 13,270,000, 13,270,000, and this is all pulling from the waterfall model. So let's talk about that because that's the biggest thing going on here. So the waterfall is going to try to incentivize your sponsor to get the best return possible for the investor. So at the top, you just define what each hurdle is, and this is an internal rate of return hurdle, which means it's basically a return that takes into the account time, i.e., $100,000 in 6 years is worth a lot less than $20,000 now. And so the investor wants to know what their wants to base their, that percentage share that they're boosting the LP up by based on the internal rate of return, not just the regular non time-based return. So our first hurdle, 10%, that's essentially kind of like your preferred return, but it's saying anything um, at 10% or lower is split 80% to the limited partner, 20% to the general. And this is just defined by the amount of equity contributed by each. And this could be, it doesn't have to be like that. You could do, you could say it's 100% to the LP until 10% is reached, which is fine. You could put 100% in here. And you can see here it's saying now distribute all money to the LP until we reach the 10% hurdle, and then we can start distributing it down through the ranks. And we are not doing that here though. Let's go back up. So at the very top, we have the whole level project assumptions. So we have our equity requirement for the project here, and then any equity requirements that happen that were not accounted for, you can actually put in here as a negative number, and it will all flow through fine. Like if I put negative 500,000 or 5, it will take that into account when measuring all the cash flows um, required by each sponsor versus, or yeah, sponsor versus investor. And you can see it's not too much of a requirement because you've got incoming cash as well as outgoing. So all that's taken into account. Um, but this is the general what has happened in the project. This is how much cash is available to split. So we're trying to figure out then how are we going to split it. So you get your total cash flows down here. We go to the tier 1 distribution. This is checking. Basically, this is how we figure out the first tier. So the hurdle's 10%. That means, the equity provided by the limited partner, aka the investor, is 2.1 million. And then in year 1, we aren't adding any equity. We are saying the preferred return due is 10%, which is just this hurdle. And then we're calculating, well, what's 10% of this equity amount? Saying, well, okay, you need to be returned this amount. And then what we've got here, though, is we've got 492,000 to distribute. So um, more cash can go to the investor than just their 10% return. 394,000 can go. So what we have to do to keep track of the internal rate of return is we now have to adjust the equity balance of the investor. So we add their preferred return. So this is saying their equity goes up to 2.3 because of that 10% requirement. But we're paying out 394. So really the new balance is 1,942,000. So then in year 2, you do the same thing, 10% of this plus whatever. So it's going up by that, but it's actually reducing the equity by this amount. And you get another ending balance. And you do that until this really ingenious formula here, basically taking the min of your total preferred return and balance and seeing if that is greater than the 80% of the cash flow. If it is, then it's choosing the lower of the two, so that'd be 80% of the cash flow. But if it's not, you can see here in year 4, what happens is now 80% of this available cash flow is more than the total balance. So this is saying now we're going to actually distribute the remaining equity to the limited partner. And here's our check right here. The internal rate of return check is going, okay, well, if those are the cash flows to the investor, does it equal internal return 10%? And you'll see if you adjust like this to like say 8%, this number here, the final number that is basically clearing them out of their first hurdle will, let's see if that goes down, it will take less. So that should go down to 16, 1.6. Yeah, it goes down to 1.4. And that all that's saying is, see, these three numbers stayed the same because you're just taking 80% of the cash flow, 80% of the cash flow, 80% of the cash flow. And then you're actually buying them out of the equity when you have enough. And the amount they get in that buyout is because of how this formula reduces the balance and multiplies by 8%. That number will always be equal to whatever their hurdle rate is. So that's the most complicated thing that's going on, and that's how it works. So then you can see how that flows through to all the tiers. So this is tier 1. The remaining amount to the general partner for tier 1 is just basically saying, okay, we distributed 390 for the investor, and that was 80%. So the sponsor, 20% of that total would be 98,000. And you see this is just 492. That's the total if you add them together. Next year, same thing. The general partner gets 20%, again 20%, and again 20%. But here's the thing: we've only distributed now 1.6 million on this because here we're doing a refinance, which increases the cash flow available. We're taking some of that to pay out to investors and the partners. So look at what happens here. You give out 1.6 to the investor, 400 to the general partner, and we know up to this point, this amount of cash has to be split at 80-20 because we haven't gotten past 10%. But we know how much cash is left now, and you can see here the cash flow for tier 2 is 2.2 million, which is simply just, if you see the math here, it's just the amount you started with minus the amount you've given to uh, the investor minus the amount that has been given to the general partner, as well as taking into account any contributions, and you then have the remaining amount of cash that goes to the next tier. So now, okay, so we split all that based on 80-20. Now our next tier is 18%, so that's tier 2. So we're going to say, okay, how is this 2.2 million going to be split? Well, from 18% up to 18%, we want to split it 75-25. So all this cash, the 2.2 million, is from 10 to 18%, but not over 18%. And you can see how that just basically splits in the same year. So here's all our other distributions we already calculated for tier 1. We can see the GP for tier 2 is not getting any tier 2. They got tier 1 here, but we're not going to add any more. And you see for the investor, we keep track. So here's tier 1, here's their tier 2. But then look at year 4, there are some tier 2. So we're going to say how much of this 2.2 million, how much of that is going to be split until we've reached the next hurdle rate. So the math is saying, keeping track of the balances based on how much is distributed, the preferred return of 18%. We now get, well, 774,000 is the amount split until we've now reached 18%. And you can see the math here to check that. So we've got the same cash flows for the first 3 years, and then now year 4, you're actually going to get 2.3 million, and you're at an 18% hurdle rate at that point. And the GP gets a little bit here as well, 258, and that's saying that's basically splitting 75-25. So now we go into tier 3, another hurdle up, 20%, which these are all these light yellow cells you can change dynamically and it will adjust. But we're saying, well, out of this 2.2 million that was available, there's still, let's see here. There's still, we only distributed 700 of it plus 258. So only about a million of it, which here it is. Well, I'll just show you, I'll add it up. So we did 2.5 plus this. The remaining amount we still got would be then what was available minus what was distributed in tier 2. So it should be 1,190,000. Yeah, it is 1,190,000. So we're now down to cash flow to tier 2. So we're saying all the rest of these cash flows have to be split in tier 3 up to 20%. And then as soon as we reach the 20% hurdle, which we got at 70-30 split, we're going to split the rest of the cash flows 50-50. And this could be whatever percent you define. Obviously, it doesn't have to be 50-50. So cash flow for tier 3, we got 1.19 million. We're saying that up to 20%, well, 224,000, which is same formula. We do that min. So what's basically, and the reason why it's min is because we're doing a negative on these negative numbers. So essentially, it's saying, what is greater, the amount of the balance less all the amounts distributed, or the 70% of the available cash is split for tier 3. And so that's saying the minimum is actually the balance here. So we're clearing off that remaining balance and getting us to the 20% hurdle. And then the general partner gets the remaining. So this is essentially 70% of the cash flow that's split in that tier, and this is 20. Now the rest of it, we're now going to cash flow after. We still have 869,000 for year 4, so we haven't even got past our refinance yet, and we've got through all of the hurdles. So that means after year 4, we're saying, well, the investor's saying, I'm happy, I got at least a 20% return or internal rate of return. I'll split everything else with you half and half. And so then any return after that is just going to raise their internal rate of return over the course of the project. So we have this thereafter. You can see this is just 50-50. If we change it to 60-40, it'd be 60-40 there. And then at the very bottom, we see the final summary. So this shows you, okay, here's the investor, here's their total cash flow, and here, we calculate that by saying, okay, here was the amount of money they contributed. They got back this amount in tier 1. They got this amount back in tier 2, tier 3, and then the final split was split like this. And you add them all up for each year, and that was how much the investor gets. Same thing with the sponsor. I know it's a lot, and this is so complicated to understand. I know that. But all you have to realize is the internal rate of return is the when you're the net present value of the future cash flows is equal to 0 at that internal rate of return. And what that means is you have to have some kind of running balance based on the required return. So if it's 10%, that's why we're adding that to the equity balance, but then reducing what was actually paid. And that allows us to know how much cash flow in that final amount, in this case it was year 4, should go to the partner to guarantee an exact 10% internal rate of return. And then after that, it's just saying, okay, well, that didn't use all the cash. We give whatever was left from that amount to the general partner, and then whatever's left after that gets split at the next tier and the next tier, and you go down and down, and that's essentially what's going on here. So it's a super sophisticated way, but a lot of real estate deals, this is what happens because the sponsor, the investors want the sponsor to be motivated to return them is the highest, internal rate of return possible. So this allows to measure the performance based on what cash flow is actually available and what the hurdles are. This will determine how it's split. And you can see the overall internal rate of return ends up 31% for the investor, 50% for the sponsor, and in all near, I think, every case, probably, unless it's some weird obscure thing, the sponsor is always going to have a higher internal rate of return, and that's because they're getting relative to the cash they put in, assuming they get to these hurdles. Now if they don't, it's just going to be an 80-20 split, so their return would be lower. Like if we put this at like 150, you could see still even a little bit higher. Let's go even higher. Just still a little bit higher because of the equity put in and out, and the versus what's returned. I'm trying to think. So total cash is 13,270,000. So this should be 80% to the investor. Just want to check this. $76%. So something must be going on. What am I missing here? Because it should be an 80-20 split the whole way. Let's see. So tier 1, and then we've reached the balance. Oh, is it doing? Let's see. Tier 2. None, they never reached 200%. I think it's because you reach that 10% hurdle and you split it then up to, you never reach 200%. So it's kind of like a mix between 820. Let's put the initial hurdle up to like some crazy number. And then it should be, the sponsor should be lower. Or the same. There we go. So yeah, it's the same. So essentially, if your return is based strictly on the amount of money you put in, then they're exactly proportional and they're the same, which makes sense. But if we adjust these, put it back to whatever, it doesn't matter because these are going to be dependent on what you want. You see the sponsor is always going to be higher in here as long as you've at least reached your bottom hurdle. Okay. So that all of that math is going into what gets distributed here to the investors versus sponsor in this executive summary. The visual just shows cash flows for the sponsored investor over time. You can see here's the refinance, here's the exit, and here's the debt and amortization schedules. We already went over that. Okay, I know that waterfall thing was tricky, but I haven't yet put together a full real estate model that was on an annual basis that had the tricky refinance logic as well as the waterfall logic at the same time, and it has a nice executive summary. So I've now got, this is something that I haven't been able to build to date, but now I've got it, and I think this is a really useful tool for multifamily real estate acquisitions. All right, guys, have a good one. Oh, obviously, I'm going to sell this. It'll be at smarthelping.com. You can download it there. Let's see. It'll be right under, if you go to the site, I'm going to write a post about it, but it'll also be under financial models, under industry-based specific. It'll say multifamily real estate acquisitions. It'll be there. And again, I only charge a one-time fee. This one I'm gonna put at $45. It will also be included in these waterfall models I did that are on a monthly basis, and that was the main reason why I wanted to do this, is because all my other models that had waterfall, it had waterfall sensitivities and everything else, was on a monthly basis. Nothing was on an annual. So that'll be included in any of the purchase of any of these. Basically, you pay one-time fee of $45, and I'll give you all of my real estate models templates. So it's a pretty good deal, I think. I mean, just can't tell you how much money has went into and time has went into building all these out like this. But that's all I got for you. I will post this onto Eloquent and eFinancial Models as well. All right. Have a great day.